order this session of the Tacoma Park City Council. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mayor Stewart,
Here.
Councilmember Kovar, Councilmember DeBala,
Here.
Councilmember Costick,
Here.
Councilmember Siemens,
Present.
Councilmember Smith,
Here.
Councilmember Searcy.
Here. Great. All right. Welcome, everyone, to our meeting this evening. There are no changes to our agenda tonight. Looking at our agenda moving forward, excuse me, I just need to pull it up here. Next week on Wednesday, April 13th, we will be here in the city chamber again. Our meeting will start at 6:30 next week with a presentation from County Council President Gabe Albanaz on the Montgomery County budget. So that's at 6:30. Our regular meeting will begin at 7:30 with a public hearing on the city manager's recommended FY 2023 budget, which we will hear this evening. Then we'll have our voting session and we'll have the first reading ordinance amending chapter 1104 regarding signs in public areas and public right of way and making no substantive changes for consistency. I'm not sure why it's called that, but okay. Our work session that night will be 2 amendments to the police employees retirement plan to change the application process for deferred retirement option program and proposed community development block grant projects. Then we will have a meeting on Monday, April 18th, because it is budget season. So we meet on Mondays and on Wednesdays. And on the 18th, our budget work session will be on operating and community service budgets. Then on Wednesday, April 20th, we are back here and we are actually going to have a long awaited welcome reception for our city manager. Jamal Fox, that will start at 6:45 p.m. We had scheduled this for early September, but because of COVID and the need for us to continue working remotely, we had to postpone it. So we will have it on Wednesday, April 20th. In addition, when we start our regular meeting at 7:30, we will have an introduction of Montgomery College scholarship recipients, those students who receive scholarships from the city. Our voting session that night will include first reading ordinance amending chapter 424 of the Tacoma Park Code on the police employees retirement plan, second reading ordinance on regulating signs in public areas, and a resolution endorsing the FY 21, FY 22, and FY 23 community development block grant projects. Our work session on the 20th will include a presentation and then discussion of the updated Adventist healthcare proposal, our on FY 2022 budget amendment number 4, and a debrief on how our redistricting process went. And then on Monday, April 25th, again, we'll have 2 budget work sessions, one on capital projects and the other on a presentation on police K-9 units. And that will take us then to Wednesday, April 27th at 7:30. We'll have a proclamation for Bike to Work Day and public hearing on the tax rate and FY 2023 budget. Voting session will be on first reading ordinance approving the FY 2022 budget amendment number 4 and second reading ordinance on the police employees retirement. So that takes us to the end of April. I'll now move to our proclamations this evening. The first one we have is in support of Arbor Day 2022 in Tacoma Park. Whereas trees are an important part of the character of Tacoma Park and provide many benefits to residents, such as improving air quality, reducing stormwater runoff, lowering summer temperatures, reducing energy use in buildings, removing air pollution, absorbing emissions that contribute to climate change, enhancing property values, improving human health, providing wildlife habitat, and contributing to the beauty of our neighborhoods. And whereas cities play a vital role in promoting and encouraging the protection and planting of trees and other environmentally sound practices, and whereas the city of Tacoma Park will be observing Arbor Day with a celebratory tree walk and community meet and greet on Saturday, April 23rd. Now, therefore, I, Kate Stewart, Mayor of the City of Tacoma Park, Maryland, on behalf of the council, residents, and staff, do hereby proclaim support for Arbor Day in the urban forest in Tacoma Park and encourage residents to plant trees and help preserve the tree canopy. In addition, I do want to note that we have a new group in Tacoma Park, Friends of Native Trees in Tacoma. And it's a group of residents who have frequently come to our city council meetings to make comments regarding planting of native trees and other native plants as a means to enhance biodiversity, address climate change, and increase the resilience of Tacoma Park. And they have a new Tacoma Park native tree selection guide that you can actually find, I believe, at the food co-op. And we will have Friends of Native Trees join us later in either April or May to talk about that. The next proclamation we have is for National Public Health Week. Whereas the week of April 4th to the 10th, 2022 is National Public Health Week, and the theme is Public Health is Where You Are. And whereas since 1995, the American Public Health Association, through its sponsorship of National Public Health Week, has educated the public, policymakers, and public health professionals about issues important to improving the public's health. And whereas U.S. life expectancy dropped from 2014 to 2017 in the longest sustained decline since the Great Recession, and only in 2018 began to increase again, U.S. life expectancy then dropped again in 2020 by a full year, which is the largest drop in life expectancy since 1943. Whereas there is a significant difference in health status such as obesity, poor mental health, and drug use among people living in rural areas compared with people living in urban areas. And this variance increases because rural residents are often more likely to face social detriments that negatively impact health, such as poverty, transportation barriers, and lack of economic opportunity. And whereas a person's health status can differ drastically by zip code due to differences in the built environment, environmental quality, community context, access to healthy food, access to education, and access to healthcare. Whereas public health professionals help communities prevent, prepare for, withstand, and recover from the impact of a full range of health threats, including disease outbreaks such as COVID-19 pandemic, measles, natural disasters, and disasters caused by human activity. And whereas public health action, together with scientific and technological advances, has played a major role in reducing and in some cases eliminating the spread of infectious disease and establishing today's disease surveillance and control systems. And whereas preventable risk factors such as physical inactivity, poor nutrition, tobacco use, and excessive alcohol use are leading causes of chronic disease, and 6 in 10 U.S. adults have a chronic disease, and 4 in 10 have 2 or more, and chronic diseases cause 7 of every 10 deaths annually in the United States. And whereas the COVID-19 pandemic has illuminated and exacerbated racial inequalities, and growing number of local, state governments, and public health leaders have declared a public health crisis. Excuse me, sorry. Now, therefore, I, Kate Stewart, Mayor of the City of Tacoma Park, on behalf of the council staff and residents, do hereby proclaim the week of April 4th through the 10th, 2022 as National Public Health Week 2022 in Tacoma Park, and call upon the residents of Tacoma Park to observe this week by helping our families, friends, neighbors, coworkers, and leaders to better understand the value of public health and supporting great opportunities to adopt preventive lifestyle habits in light of this year's theme, Public Health is Where You Are. And I would like to introduce Kelly Umana, board member of the Maryland Public Health Association, who's just going to say a few words for us this evening.
Do I click? Oh, it's on already. Thank you so much to the City of Tacoma Park for declaring this week as National Public Health Week. I myself am a public health professional in the state of Maryland, along with working alongside Mayor Kate Stewart in several public health activities in our community. We have done COVID-19 vaccines in apartment buildings, in people's homes, in creating opportunities for everybody to have equal access to all healthcare access in their communities. And so I thank you all here today for declaring today as National Public Health Week. And I hope that we continue to see and create new opportunities for more preventable public health access to all of our communities. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us this evening and for all your work. All right. Moving on now, we have adoption of minutes. We have the January 12th, 2022 minutes that were circulated. Would someone like to move adoption of the minutes? Councilman Searcy, and then Councilmember Seaman second. Any comments or questions on the minutes? All right, seeing none. All right, I have two council members remote. So why aren't the two remote council members raise your hand in a, oh, well, no, that won't work. I didn't think about this beforehand. I'm going to have the clerk call the vote. Thank you.
Sure.
Just so we make sure we get everything on the record.
Councilmember Kovar,
Aye.
Councilmember Dabala,
Yes.
Councilmember Costick,
Yes.
Councilmember Siemens,
Aye.
Councilmember Smith,
Yes.
Councilmember Searcy,
Aye.
Mayor Stewart.
Yes. All right, next we have our legislative update. Do we have Suhani with us? Great. All right, Suhani, we're winding down, huh?
Yes, we are. All right. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Mayor Stewart, members of the council. Is everyone able to hear me okay?
You're a little soft and I don't know if it's us or you.
Sorry.
Suhani's taking us on a tour of her.
Our fire alarm keeps going off.
Oh,
I'm gonna
okay.
get this
We
outside.
we can hear you now. Thank you.
Okay. So yes, for general updates, there's only a few days left of session. Sine die will be on Monday, April 11th. So this means there are going to be a lot of floor sessions and probably a number of voting sessions in the coming days. So we'll anticipate that. Just a couple updates on some big bills that Tacoma Park has been following. A number of bills are passing through the General Assembly and were sent to the governor last Friday. The governor now has until this Friday to either sign those bills or veto those bills. And if the governor does veto the bills, then the General Assembly will have an opportunity to override the governor's veto at that point. So the Climate Solutions Now bill is on that list. A lot of the environmental community, I think, is anticipating a veto possibly, since the governor has made some statements on the bill. And since we're on the topic of Climate Solutions Now, I can kind of give a quick rundown on what has happened to the bill. It came out just a little bit more bruised after a number of House amendments, after it went through the Environment and Transportation and Economic Matters committees. But it's still a good bill. It's in pretty good shape, and it's taking really big strides in the climate space. So some highlights from the bill are just that it reduces greenhouse gas emissions by 60% by 2031 and reaching net zero by 2045. It expands the state's use of electric vehicles. There's new building energy performance standards. There's targeted investments for low income and communities of color who have historically faced environmental burdens. And it also establishes a green bank to finance clean energy. In addition to climate, cannabis has also passed out of both chambers. The ballot measure, House Bill 1, has passed. This would place cannabis legalization on the ballot for voters to decide. In addition to the amendment, there's also a companion bill, which is the cannabis reform bill. The reform bill still imposes some civil and personal use penalties until July 1st of 2023, which is when legislation would go into effect if legalization was voted favorably during the coming election. So outside of those kind of broad bills, a couple of the transportation bills that Tacoma Park has specifically followed included the Vision Zero bill, which is Delegate Plakovich's CARS bill. That has passed through the House and is on third reader in the Senate, so it should be moving. Safe roads, unfortunately, this is Delegate Charkoudian's bill. This bill initially passed through the House, but it has not moved out of the Senate Finance Committee, and it's looking like it's going to be stuck in there. There were some concerns on the costs and the impacts of the bill. And then for housing, a number of bills have moved. A bill to fund legal assistance to renters has passed. Emergency rental assistance has passed. And there's still a few bills that are pending that may move that will also support renters. and just some general updates that kind of impact the healthcare of residents in Tacoma Park include an adult dental bill. So a bill was passed to create a dental benefit for adults on Medicaid. And there's also a bill that passed that would provide prenatal care for pregnant immigrants. So other than that, we'll continue to keep an eye on bills that Tacoma Park has weighed in on, and we'll continue monitoring until the end of session, which is very, very close.
Great, thank you, Suhani. Does anyone have any questions? Yes, Councilwoman DeBala.
Yeah, I just have one. Do you now have a complete text for the climate solutions bill as gone to the sent to the governor? So could you shoot me a copy? Thank you.
I can send that over. Yes.
Yeah, it's been a work in progress, I know.
It has.
Great, and I'm just gonna say, I cannot see Councilmember Kovar or Smith. I just see Suhani, so I don't know if it's possible. If I can.
I'm okay.
All right, you're good. Councilmember Smith, you're good?
No questions.
Thank you. All right, Suhani, thank you so much, and good luck on the last week. All right, now we'll move on to public comments. Since we're doing this hybrid, we first take public comments in the auditorium. So if anyone has public comments, please come to the podium. After public comments here in the auditorium, we will go to public comments on online. So you are up, Mr. Gibson.
Thank you. Greetings, council members. My name is Randy Gibson, Ward 3, and a member of Climate Action Coffee. The city declared a climate emergency in 2019, and we agree. I will share tonight the good, the bad, and the actionable, specifically on the subject of civic activism and public green space. First, the good. Two things that make Tacoma Park great, and I'm glad that the Arbor Day was proclaimed, is a healthy tree canopy. A second is robust civic activism. Case in point, on Saturday, March 26th, more than 20 Tacoma Park residents and friends came out to protect city-owned Dorothy's Woods from invasive plants, coordinated by Climate Action Coffee and cleared through Public Works. Volunteers removed kudzu, garlic mustard, English ivy, and Japanese honeysuckle, and trash from the slopes of Dorothy's Woods. 22 trees were rescued. Joined by CCAN and Friends of Dorothy's Woods, we demonstrated that we care about our public green space and this small wooded ecosystem in particular. This is not the first time. For several years, local residents have pulled invasives and picked up trash in this 2.5-acre site, one of the largest undeveloped sites in the city. Home of nearly 24 native tree species, an underground stream, Dorothy's Woods deserves our collective protection, care, and restoration. Now the bad. Notwithstanding the helpfulness of members of the Public Works, I would characterize the city's recent approach to Dorothy's Woods as one of risk aversion and neglect. The impact of this approach is to discourage civic activism, restrict needed conservation efforts, and ignore opportunities to increase accessibility and education. The city attorney's recent recommendation imposes, among other things, other hurdles, an onerous 10-day advance volunteer waiver process. Is this time needed to do background checks on volunteers? Lastly, the actionable, what you can do. The council has the clear authority to interpret the covenant of Dorothy's Woods that encourages responsible stewardship and civic activism. Facing a climate emergency requires us to protect our woodlands and public green spaces. Why shortchange those efforts by discouraging resident involvement? How many of you schedule your family weekends 10 days out? How many make last-minute weekend decisions? Council members, review your stewardship obligations and consider how healthy trees and robust resident involvement make Tacoma Park great. One small, tiny step is to create a same-day volunteer waiver process. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gibson. Any other public comments here this evening?
So I'll just go to Galish. Gonna be in.
You are. Arthur David Olson, Herbie Hancock Avenue. Tonight, I'll cover 3 more areas I hope the council will include in its review of redistricting: census, charter, and consultants. council members have already suggested asking the Census Bureau to split large census blocks in the city. Doing so would eliminate the need to split them in redistricting and would increase confidence in ward demographics. If the council is intent on making communities of interest a factor in redistricting, you may also want to ask the Bureau to merge census blocks. As an example, making the entire area of the South of Sligo Citizens Association a single census block would help ensure that it wasn't split between wards. The city charter's section 301C and 401B50 outline redistricting criteria. There's a mismatch with those criteria used this year. Communities of interest and consistency with the existing ward boundaries are not mentioned in the charter. They might be added. On the other hand, compactness and equality of population are mentioned in the charter, but were of low importance in this year's redistricting. Those factors might be removed from the charter. While the city would still need to follow county, state, and federal law regarding them, dropping them would reflect the city council's sense that they are relatively unimportant. Consultants reported overwhelming community support for one of two final redistricting options. The majority of the council, voting as representatives of the community, selected the other option. Consultant outreach seems flawed. Consultants strongly recommended not splitting census blocks. The council chose to do so. Consultant process seems flawed. The majority of the council rejected one of the two final consultant options out of hand. Consultant results seem flawed. And one of the two options initially presented to the council this year was just a few census blocks different from the result produced by free automatic redistricting software last August. Consultants were slower and far costlier. I hope there will be a thorough review of the use of consultants in redistricting. Still to come, yet another C, the role of council in redistricting. And when you receive my written comments, there will be the two maps that I refer to that are the differences between the consultants and the free software. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other public comments in the auditorium this evening? All right, seeing none, then we will turn to Mr. Hubner online.
Am I live?
You're live, Mr. Hubner. Go ahead.
Great. Good evening. Paul Hubner, Ward 3. I'd like to talk about tonight's upcoming budget discussion. The two largest expenses in the city budget, according to the city manager's report at the last council meeting, are personnel at 65 to 80% and capital projects at 22%. Of the personnel expenses, a large percentage go to funding managers and directors. In my opinion, managerial expenses account for a disproportionate amount of city personnel costs. We have upper-level FTEs who manage only a few people, but have salaries equal to those managers who work for Montgomery County or larger cities with much larger commercial tax bases and who supervise hundreds or even thousands more people. The salary equivalency studies done by the city every 3 years compare positions, not levels of responsibility or numbers of employees managed. Capital projects such as the dog park, the library renovation, and the police atrium, all of which have run wildly over budget, can help explain why capital projects represent 22% of the city's budget. Projects regularly run over budget and are completed well past the original due dates. They lack carefully defined budgets and often languish without bids or signed contracts for months or even years. These problems point to the inefficient and mismanaged capital projects. More than 50% of the city's revenue stream is from property taxes. Another bundle of our tax dollars, intergovernmental transfers, are routed through the county and account for a whopping 33% of additional city revenue. So Tacoma Park residents already pay exorbitant taxes in a state with the 6th highest cost of living in the country. 2 weeks ago, the city manager said that the property tax rate had decreased over the last 10-year period, but the property tax rate has been static or the same for the last 3 years at 53.97 cents per $100 of property value. During that same 3-year period, revenue has increased as property values have skyrocketed. We also learned that the city has an unassigned reserve balance of $7.1 million, which is some 50% higher than has been proposed and approved by multiple votes of this council. I very much look forward to explanations about the dollar amounts of these new sources of revenue discussed by the city manager and the finance director. I also hope to see the city achieve the 9% cut to expenditures that both the city manager and finance director said they need to balance the budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hubner. Next is Ms. Mary Jane Machuey.
Hello? Hi,
Yes, go ahead, Ms. Machuey. We can hear you.
can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm sorry, my son has a TV on in the next room, but I was not unable to bring up this meeting on my iPad. It somehow ate the URL. I couldn't find it. I'm just recently I found out the comedian Chris Rock said he had nonverbal learning disability, and I think he had a lot of courage to say that. That's what I was diagnosed with. I'm in when I was about 40 years old, and some of the characteristics are you're awkward. I was always awkward in school, and no one ever wanted to play baseball with me. I was always the last person selected on the team, and I ended up being very shy and awkward. And I have very poor spatial skills. I flunked geometry, and kept me out of the honor roll. And I just wanted to say that there's a lot of social isolation dealing with people like me and who are worse off than me, like my son. I started Parents of Special Needs Adults in 2005, and there hasn't been very much progress made. And I wish more progress is made. I'm especially concerned of what's going to happen to my son when I can no longer be with him. I'm 74 years old. And what's going to happen to him? He's going to end up on the street. I mean, and others like him. I have just $100,000 saved my whole life. That's all. I've always been low income, and I've never been able to save more than that. And that's not enough to keep him going for very long. And there's others like me in that same situation. It's even worse when you're low income, but it's really stressful to have your only son or daughter to have his special needs, and to see them suffering and being mistreated at work. It's almost impossible to get a job for him. And then when you get a job, they treat you like garbage. I mean, he's been yanked around so many times, and there's I've seen he's been mistreated by different races and sexes. It's nothing. It's like he and in all black school, he was never once allowed to be on the basketball team, and it really killed him. They wouldn't let him play for 1 second. And the white kids all thought wouldn't associate with him because they thought he was stupid. And he didn't have much of a life. And I'm sorry, I wish that you just would do this city and the town and whatever, would do some more to help people like him. I've been trying to get an ADU for him in the house, and I'm pretty sure my application is going to be turned down again by Habitat. For some reason, they seem to not like me, and I mailed it certified, and I got receipts because I don't trust them, but they're probably going to turn it down, I'm sure. But anyways, and the Maryland Department of Assessments and Taxation. Oh my God, it's almost impossible. And I'm trying to help other people who are similar to me apply for tax credits. It's almost impossible, these people. You get a recorded message, 410-767-1184. Try calling that number.
Thank you, Ms.
That was the
Machuey.
number
And
my mom gave me.
Thank you, Ms. Machuey. And if you need help with getting in touch with ESTAT, you can email me, and we're happy to connect you with some city staff or Delegate Charkoudian's office. So thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you. I'm not going to do anything, I'm sure.
That concludes our public comments for this evening. All right, now we will turn to council comments. Any council comments? Anybody? Councilman Costick.
Thank you. Thank you to all the public commenters. Happy to follow up with all of you after the meeting by email or phone, and we can touch base on the topics you've all raised. I just had a couple of announcements. Tonight, last night, I had the opportunity to attend for at least a little bit of time the New Hampshire Avenue BRT community, if I remember the name right, I think it's Community Action Committee or Community Access Committee meeting. And it was really great to see a number of Tacoma Park residents who are on that committee and are working towards hopefully building out a BRT system along New Hampshire Avenue in the future. So looking forward to more updates from that in the future. It's going to be ongoing and the meetings are all public, so people are welcome to attend and provide your input as they continue to work on this. Also want to let everyone know that thank you to city staff and the mayor and Councilmember Dabala for helping walk through some answers to our Transportation Planning Board survey that we submitted to the Transportation Planning Board on the city's perspective related to some climate aspects related to transportation that the Transportation Planning Board at the regional level will be looking at. And we'll be hearing the results of that survey later this month at the National Capital Region TBB meeting. And then finally, also just wanted to let folks know that it still looks like we are going to get a stop sign at Lincoln and Carroll Avenue. This is something we've been working very, very hard on with State Highway. And we thought it was going to happen about a week ago, but I think we are incredibly close and we'll soon have that in place, at least temporarily. I think the long-term prognosis is a little unclear. It's a temporary measure that's being put in place while we have Sligo Creek closed off for trail work. But we're hoping this will show that it is a good change and we can keep it long-term. So keep your eyes peeled for that. It might be a new thing to see as you're driving down Carroll. And that's all for me. Thank you. Yes, and make sure you stop and do not drive through it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Costick. Councilman Dabala.
Yes, good evening. Just two things. Speaking of climate, this week was the Montgomery County Climate Energy Summit in Silver Spring, and most of the sessions were pretty technical, but the one that I thought was personally the most interesting brought 4 county departments together for, I think, the first time to talk about what each of them is doing on climate. So the obvious, Adriana Hochberg and Lindsay Shaw, who's the head of the community-based climate programs, but also the head of the building code programs and the head of the county building operations programs, who I'd never actually met before. And so I thought that was quite instructive. And if anybody wants to talk to me afterwards, just let me know. The other thing is thank you to Public Works. We had a great meeting on the Belford Place sidewalks. And I think the next step is a letter to members of the neighborhood, which I believe went out today, asking folks to vote, to be polled on whether they are in concept okay with a sidewalk on the 2 blocks of Belford Place. So if you live in that neighborhood, stay tuned. That's it for me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councilman Searcy.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much to those that provided public comments this evening. I have a couple of quick updates. First, I want to thank the Tacoma Park Police Department. I have the pleasure of participating in the Community Police Academy that is happening on Tuesday evenings. I learned a valuable lesson last night. I do not have the short-term memory skills to be a dispatcher. I cannot remember numbers. So it is a wonderful opportunity for people in the community to learn about firsthand what a number of our officers go through on a day-to-day basis. So want to thank the police department for putting together such a great academy. Also, just want to make a quick announcement. So the Tacoma Langley Crossroads Development Authority is planning for the next summer Mercado. It will be on Saturday, June the 25th from 1 to 6. And they are looking for businesses or local food vendors or artists or handmade crafts, musical performers that might be interested in participating in the event. There's no application fee for members of the Tacoma Langley Crossroads CDA. We typically bring in about 500 folks, and it's on Ann Street. And so we're just encouraging people to apply. And the deadline for to apply as a vendor is May the 6th. And if you have any questions about that, please feel free to contact the Tacoma Langley Crossroads CDA. And lastly, Ann Street is getting ready to have a farmer's market again. The Crossroads Farmers Market will begin on Wednesdays from 10:30 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. On April the 27th. So that will start on the 27th. So I want to encourage people to come out and get some fabulous food on Wednesdays, some healthy veggies. Definitely the place to be on a Wednesday afternoon. And that is all I have. Thanks so much.
And we all know you're going for the churros.
I'm going for the churros.
So you can say healthy veggies. But we know it's a cover. Councilmember Kovar, Councilmember Smith, do you have public comments tonight?
Yeah, I
Councilmember,
just would
wanna
like
go
to
first?
say,
Yeah,
first, I want to thank Wayne Sherwood for being so gracious and giving all council members and a number of senior staffers the copy of the autobiography written by news reporter Bruce Johnson, Surviving Deep Waters. This was just a very nice gesture from Mr. Sherwood. There's great stories that Mr. Johnson tells about his time reporting here in the District of Columbia. But I also want to offer my condolences to Brother Johnson and his family. He recently had a heart attack and passed away last week. I think it would have been great for residents of the city and my colleagues on the council to have a reading by Mr. Johnson and talk about his book at his time here in the district. So I do hope our library does go back to a book club and we can discuss this very important book, Surviving Deep Waters. Thank you.
thank you, Councilmember Smith. Councilmember Kovar.
I'm okay, thanks.
Great, thank you. I just have a couple of things. Last week on Thursday and Friday, I was in Annapolis for the Maryland Mayors Association meeting and had the opportunity to testify on bill that the city was supporting. And actually will send the city staff. We had a couple of really interesting presentations that I will share with folks, but one of them was on surplus supplies that you can get from the state government. And the mayor of Bladensburg talked about a number of computers that she has received and bottled waters. And it seems that the state gets a great deal, has a great deal of surplus supplies, and it doesn't all fit in their warehouse. And so they get some odd things that we don't need, but it sounded like they get some really interesting things that we could use in the city, and I'll pass along that contact information. When I was there, it was also the governor announced coming to terms on the highway user revenue fee amount. That is money that we get on transportation issues and that municipalities have basically been shortchanged on for a number of years. And it looks like we actually have an agreement on it moving forward. And I just want to do a shout out to Councilmember Smith, who has served on the Maryland Municipal League's board and the legislative committee and worked on this issue for many years. And I just want to say 2022 was the year we got HUR and tax duplication addressed. So it's a very good year. Last night, I was invited to speak to the PTAs of Tacoma Park Elementary School and Piney Branch. And one of the questions the PTA had was with Lucy Neary retiring, if there was going to be a bike to school day activities on May 4th. And they were going to follow up with staff. But I think that was a question that a number of the parents also had. And we talked about the stop sign. And then I just want to say thank you for the public comments this evening. And I would just ask the city manager if maybe we could revisit and look at the 10-day notice needed for volunteers and just come back to us. And if we could have an understanding of if the city attorney had proposed that, the reasoning behind that, and if we could maybe take another look at that, because I agree with Mr. Gibson, 10 days planning these days seems like a lot for families. So if we could discuss that, that would be great. So that's it for me. I'll turn it over to the city manager.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Originally, I wasn't going to say anything because I have the budget tonight, but I'll just say when we actually presented about providing access to city property, we worked, I know we worked with Councilmember Dabala, and even though we have a 10-day, we decreased that to 7 days to be able to turn it around. So it's giving staff time to be able to process applications of folks who want to use property. So it's not necessarily 10 days as a disclaimer, but we can move it faster. With that, nothing further. Thank you.
Thank you to the city manager. That is it for comments. And now we have two presentations this evening. The first will be on the task force on sustainable banking and investment. And are you all here? Did you all come tonight? That's awesome. That's terrific. So I think, am I first going to turn it back to the city manager to tee this up, or deputy?
Yep, I'll turn it over to the Deputy City Manager, Jessica Clark.
Okay.
Sure. So I'm not surprised at all that our full task force is here. This task force has done an unbelievable job putting together a 50-page report in a matter of a few months. It's very in-depth. It revolves around 8 recommendations, and we have our chair, vice chair, and secretary of the task force, as well as other members who are going to present all of the recommendations to you all tonight. And we're, again, very pleased to see you all here in person. And thank you so much for all of your work over the past few months. This group has been meeting every other week and having subgroups, doing research, meeting with our pension board and city staff. And so the report really reflects that background research. And there's also a lot of expertise on this committee in terms of everyone's daytime jobs as well. So really lucky to benefit from this group and look forward to your presentation. I think I'm handing it over to Victor first to open us up.
Okay, thanks very much and good evening. My name is Victor Tironi. I was chair of the Sustainable Banking Investment Task Force, but that task force went out of existence on March 22nd, but I'm happy to be here as chair emeritus or whatever it is. So you have our report that Jessica described briefly already. It provides background in its first 4 sections and recommendations in section 5 and in appendix C with respect to the Nuclear-Free Tacoma Committee. Most of the report was agreed to by all the task force members, but there are 2 sections with separate views on the Nuclear-Free Tacoma Committee and on nuclear power, located in appendix D. So we tried to put some of the details to the appendix to make the main report a little more user-friendly. In preparing the report, we worked in small groups, shared drafts, which we all edited and went over in our meetings. First the draft report and then the final report. We heard public comments on the draft at our meeting on March 7 and revised the draft in response. Most of the drafts based on our research and our discussion, but we also spoke with representatives of the city's finance department and the police pension fund to get their views and to make sure the facts were accurate. We held a total of 9 meetings, the last one in person. The report is detailed and technical, but the basic recommendations are straightforward. I will summarize very quickly and colleagues will weigh in on details. We suggest to revise the city's investment policy to mandate application of ESG criteria. ESG means environmental, social, and governance criteria. They're sort of, asked for it now, but they're not really required. So that's something to be drafted and voted on by council. Council to decide whether to issue an RFP for banking services, and then evaluating the responses and selecting a new bank if there are positive responses. Selecting CDs, certificates of deposit, from financial institutions that have a good ESG profile. Encourage the police pension fund to revise its investment policy. They're independent, but they could be inspired by what the city does. And then this one is sort of a sleeper, but it's the most money involved, about $9 billion, not the city's money, but the Maryland Local Government Investment Pool. City has a small amount, but we could work with other jurisdictions and maybe invest this money in a way that maybe gets us a better return and also has a better social impact. All of this work could benefit from creating a new sustainable banking investment committee, given that otherwise city staff might be hard pressed to do all of these tasks. Finally, revitalizing and recruiting new members for the Nuclear Free Tacoma Park Committee. The report also has some recommendations to streamline and update the tasks of the committee. And if the city decides to establish a sustainable banking committee, how to allocate responsibilities between these two committees. Although this is a technical report, remember the context, which involves existential global threats, global warming and nuclear war. While Tacoma Park can't solve these problems by itself, we can do our part through more socially aware investing and encouraging others and other jurisdictions to do likewise. Thank you, and happy to answer questions at the appropriate time.
Hello. So Leslie Hunter, I think our slides are slightly out of order here. So if you could go to the ESG slide to start off with, I think that's the third or fourth one. But yeah, so I will begin with a brief definition about environmental. Oh, thank you so much. We have this clicker. Is it working? Nope. All right, so I'll begin with a brief definition about environmental, social, and governance scoring, and then outline our recommendations, our edits to the city's investment policy, and recommendations for the city's or the police pension fund. In terms of ESG investing or environmental, social, and governance investing, it is becoming a much more common way for investors to identify sustainability investments that align with their values, while avoiding risks associated with investing in assets or in sectors that are not sensitive to ESG metrics. ESG investing adopts a diversified approach, assessing companies' comprehensive performance against the metrics that you see on this slide here. But really, environmental metrics encompass the company or investees' impact on the environment, greenhouse gas emissions, renewable energy use, and other issues. Social metrics discuss how companies manage relationships with their employees, how, for example, how they are incorporating diversity, equity, inclusion practices, and also on their impact on surrounding communities. And then governance deals with how companies deal with their board of directors, executive pay, internal controls, and other issues. I don't know if this is working. That's great. So our first recommendation is to edit the city's investment policy, specifically sections 4 and 9, adding a fourth investment objective on sustainable investment, and then detailing that more extensively in section 9. But really, as Victor mentioned, to require the consideration of ESG criteria in all investment decisions. And we're saying with the same weight as other material factors influencing investment. And I think there's a strong argument for how ESG is a material investment decision. And we also updated some of the language in the policy to better align with the city's 2020 climate emergency response framework and climate targets to align investment objectives with the climate plan. So, ESG, as I mentioned, is diversified, looking at the holistic impact of companies on this variety of metrics. It's by nature big picture or bigger picture, but we're also recommending some exclusionary criteria. So complete divestment from certain categories. The city already has exclusionary criteria for nuclear weapons producers. So that stays in the investment policy. We are recommending that the city include in its exclusionary criteria divestment from large fossil fuel reserve holders. And we reference a list, Carbon Underground 200, that other investors have been using. And we're not at this time recommending complete divestment from other sectors. Just given the risks of too limited investment options, risk of to returns over time. But we present some alternative views on nuclear power in the report. And I think will be detailed later on this presentation. But one thing that we noted in that discussion was that there are many companies that have nuclear assets that are also some of the largest developers of wind and solar power. So it's kind of weighing priorities there. So, ESG, there are a variety of ways of approaching this. It's, as I mentioned, it's sensitive to returns while being aligned with values. Nevertheless, there are some shortcomings according to if adhering to the current ESG landscape. The information is voluntarily disclosed by companies. There are third-party companies that score ESG information that are not always transparent, but the landscape is changing pretty quickly. There's a lot of international regulation happening right now. That a couple of weeks ago, the Securities and Exchange Commission also released a proposed rule on climate disclosures that would require public companies to include climate information about their climate risks and associated information in their financial filings. So that information will become more easier to access. So in the short term for the investment policy, however, we're recommending a more passive approach where the city, is looking at these ESG ratings. While imperfect, it's a good starting point. And then investing in ESG labeled funds. And these are funds that companies like Vanguard will put together, looking at, how do they adhere to certain criteria that people generally say are sensitive to ESG. But in the longer term, we are recommending a more active ESG investing strategy, which could come with higher costs. But many ESG strategies are customized for the needs of the entity that is making the investments. Often need to consult an investment advisor to do that. But we provide some recommendations in the report to get started. So that's on the investment policy. And will we be taking questions at the end of the presentation? Okay, great. And then the pension fund. So just to mention, the pension fund, the police pension fund, is not governed by the city's investment policy. It's administered independently and subject to state and federal laws and regulations. Of note, the pension fund has the fiduciary duty to run the plan solely in the interest of participants and beneficiaries for the exclusive purpose of providing benefits and paying plan expenses. However, the police pension fund represents the largest long-term investment assets of the city. The city and the police pension fund also have a common interest under the existing governance for exploring ways to jointly achieve the investment goals of the city. And two, related to the fiduciary duty or solely sole interest in the benefits and in paying plan expenses to those who are affected by it. There are many studies that find that ESG and climate aligned investment is aligned with fiduciary duty, that it has an impact, positive impact on returns over time. There's a study recently from the Maryland State Retirement and Pension System that found that the Maryland State Retirement and Pension System had sacrificed returns of more than 15 percentage points since 2010 in the public equities portion of the fund by investing in large fossil fuel reserve holders. So that's a pretty striking finding, and then we wanted to mention that in the report. So at a minimum, we're suggesting that the city urge the police pension fund to consider adopting ESG policies, which are currently articulated in the investment policy manual that's published by the Maryland State Retirement Agency, and we include reference to that in the report. The pension fund can also work with its current investment advisor to develop a phased strategy to invest all or a portion of its funds in diversified ESG options. And lastly, in our meeting that we had with the police pension fund representatives about a month ago, they had asked for guidance and definitions on sustainability investing. And we have a lot of that in the report that you're welcome to refer them to. But thank you.
Thanks, Leslie. Okay. My name is Rachel Lingus, and I'm a Ward 2 resident, and I was very pleased to serve as the secretary of this august task force. I'm going to talk very briefly of 3 of the recommendations in quick succession here. The first was with respect to banking services. So the way that we approached this was essentially taking a look at all the financial services that the city utilizes and its current financial service provider, which is Truist, formerly SunTrust Bank. And then we also took a look at how that the choice of Truist, whether that is coherent with the city's stated goals for climate and nuclear-free policy. So just to summarize the current situation, Tacoma Park does its banking services with Truist. This includes checking accounts, and there's a variety of different accounts: the Stormwater Fund, Speed Camera Fund, and the ARA Fund. Also, the city pays its employees through SunTrust Bank, and mostly that's direct deposit, but there's also about 20 employees that prefer physical checks that can be cashed at Truist. And of course, Truist is located in downtown Tacoma Park, so that proximity is something that's important for the city in its financial service providers. And there's also payments to vendors. So in reviewing the city's legislation and kind of the policy framework, we find that Truist does provide financing to nuclear weapons producers. And this is something that the Nuclear Free Tacoma Park Committee has notified the city council in the past and kind of made a recommendation to change its financial service provider. We also held meetings with the city finance director to kind of understand what that process might look like, and whether there would be sufficient staff time and kind of the administrative capacity to make a change like that, because it's a large change. And through those conversations and our research, we came to understand that probably that this is something that the city should revisit, because its choice of financial service provider is seemingly not in compliance with its stated goals. And given the city's procurement policy, it can't just change banks, but perhaps, a way to do this thoughtfully would be to issue an RFP for an institution that would provide banking services. And in that RFP, the city could include a criterion for requiring the financial institution that it does do banking with to have some kind of an ESG policy. And the institution should also disclose whether it provides financing to nuclear weapons producers. So essentially we're saying use your procurement policy, go out there and, you know, see what the market can provide. And you can write the RFP such that you weight these criteria different ways. You could also weight highly, you know, the proximity and the ability of city employees to go cash their checks. But I think that you could also kind of encourage financial institutions that are out there and want Takoma Park as a client to come up with some creative way. There's a lot of technology, you know, for payroll, and then you could also weight more heavily that the bank might have an ESG policy that sort of is coherent with Takoma Park's stated goals and values, and they also don't happen to finance nuclear weapons providers. So that's our proposal. Next is certificates of deposit. So in our conversations with the city's finance director, we came to understand that the city purchases CDs primarily for liquidity purposes and secondarily for yield. So, you know, most of you are familiar with certificates of deposits. They're sort of time bound and they offer a small return. The city uses MBS, which is it's a firm to find CDs to purchase. And in the process of kind of presenting options for the finance director, MBS, you know, it's really just looking at like the length of time that the city needs to invest and secondarily the yield of the CD. But within that process of like presenting options, you know, they don't propose any kind of ESG friendly institutions. There's not even a consideration there. So we think that maybe MBS, or if MBS doesn't have this capacity, perhaps the city could consider another broker that does, could screen banks that issue CDs by using some kind of an ESG filter. Essentially they can identify ESG friendly financial institutions. And this could be one of the lenses through which, you know, CDs are presented to the city finance director when the city is looking to purchase CDs. And, you know, there's a lot of financial institutions now that are ESG friendly. The city could consider credit unions that offer some kind of community benefit when purchasing CDs, or potentially there's large financial institutions like Credit Suisse that provide green CDs. So there should be options out there. And this could be just one of the 3 criteria, including, you know, liquidity or the term of the CD and yield that the city the finance director or the city could consider when purchasing CDs. And finally, Victor mentioned this Maryland local government investment pool. The chart on the right of this slide shows a little the asset composition of that pool. This is from Standard & Poor. The city holds about 1.4 million in this pool. It's managed by PNC Bank and administered by the state treasurer. This is a very large pool of assets for the state of Maryland, approximately 9 billion. And you can see that it's invested very, very conservatively here. It's primarily US Treasuries, repo, ABS. Its short-term investment goals are for the governments that use this investment vehicle to preserve the capital invested, provide a competitive rate of return, and offer liquidity. And the city of Takoma Park does not have any discretion over how these funds are invested. Specifically, there's a lot of potential here, given that this is a large amount of public funds, to develop a carefully formulated socially responsible investment policy that could not only allow these to be invested in a way that has a more positive impact on society, the residents of the state of Maryland, but could also potentially result in a higher rate of return, because as you can see there, these are very conservative assets that the pool is invested in. So, and our proposals for the city of Takoma Park to essentially use its voice as an investor in the local government investment pool, to speak with other local governments that are invested in this pool that might be like-minded, and see if there's a way to go about encouraging the vehicle to consider more explicitly the social impact of its investments. Thank you very much.
Hey, y'all. I'm Will Gerardo. I'm over on Lincoln. Appreciate the stop sign. I was going to have slides, but well, life. So looking at the Nuclear Free Tacoma Park Committee, we were assigned to consider specific tasks assigned to the Nuclear Free Committee, such as existing contracts, awards, purchase orders, et cetera. After discussions with representatives of the committee, looking at their website, looking at their minutes, we found that reviewing those tasks was a bit difficult because unfortunately we didn't find much evidence that any work was done on those tasks. For example, the committee may review any work within the city, which it has reason to believe is not in compliance. Though the committee may review, we did not find evidence that they had actually engaged in reviewing any of the work. Another one is the committee shall review existing contracts, awards, purchase orders, investments, and then make recommendations. We, again, after looking at it, we found very little evidence that that was done over the years. Another one is the committee, in conjunction with the city manager, shall propose a socially responsible investment policy, and then annually thereafter review the investment policy. We found no evidence that that was done or that it was considered. Another one is that the committee shall, through the collection of materials, newsletters, cable television programming, make recommendations to the committee, to the council. We think they did a pretty good job. They're pretty vocal. We like that. They did great. The fourth of five was the committee shall maintain a collection of current materials concerning the production of nuclear weapons, more information, and then shall annually prepare a report to the city council, a list of nuclear weapon producers. We found no evidence that the committee has a collection of current materials. There's a spot on their website for stuff, but there's no evidence of any work on that one that they had done. And then the last of their 5 tasks was, before a waiver of provisions that may be sought, the committee, in conjunction with city manager, shall conduct a diligent search to determine the availability of reasonable alternative sources for products or services. I think they, opined on Truist. Before Truist, we found no evidence that they had done any of that action previously. So what we have done was essentially an academic exercise without a body of evidence for which we can look at and opine and discuss. We were then left to think, well, what could happen and what we could be doing. But unfortunately, with the lack of product, we were limited, but we did try to do our best. Thank you.
Is it my turn? So I've got some, my name is Paul Gunter. I'm with the Nuclear Free Tacoma Park Committee. And I've got some a brief prepared remark, but I think I'd like to have some extemporaneous remarks as well. But I'd like to speak on the task force recommendation 5G as it relates to the city nuclear free zone ordinance and the 2 existential threats that now dominate today's current events, namely the narrowing window of opportunity left to mitigate the catastrophic consequences of climate crisis and the threat of nuclear war erupting out of the Russia's unprovoked attack on Ukrainian sovereignty. Specifically, the council requested that the task force to clarify, quote, how the ordinance shall apply to the city uses and impacts of nuclear generated electric power, as well as nuclear weapons. The nuclear free ordinance, as codified in its purpose, states without any ambiguity, residents and representatives are urged to redirect resources previously used for nuclear weapons and nuclear power generation towards endeavors which promote and enhance life. The task force responded, quote, expertise in nuclear-free sustainability is not an expertise of the majority of the task force members, nor I add, given the task to lay out the framework of the sustainable banking and financing plan, was there really any sufficient time allocated to additionally undertake the taxonomy of nuclear power? Instead, the task force recommends that the quote, the current city code language be kept until a body with the appropriate subject matter expertise from all sides of the discussion convene, discuss, and provide a recommendation, unquote. Now, I want to emphasize that the task force recommendation that the current city code language be kept in place until, unquote, should not be misconstrued as a wait and see approach for a yet to be determined panel. For its part, the city, per guidance of the Nuclear Free Zone Act and the active support of the Nuclear Free Committee, has redirected the investment power away from listed nuclear weapons manufacturers and decisively redirected its municipal electric purchasing power to 100% renewable energy, as well as educate its residents to do so. The committee, as the city designated advocate for the Nuclear Free Zone Act, has the experience and the networking for this complex task, with emphasis on non-proliferation, just transition, and sustainability. Therefore, on behalf of the committee, we take this opportunity to respectfully request that should the council adopt this recommendation, that it incorporate the committee's participation in the planning, preparation, and presentation for this event. But, you know, I did want to respond to some of the concerns. I don't know that I wasn't on the subcommittee that reviewed before with the city on the approach that that an informal agreement between the Nuclear Free Committee and the city has developed over decades. This is not something that is new, but the occurrence of, in my understanding and the rest of the committee's understanding, is that where the review, the city review of contracts and purchase agreements, this is a rare event that has occurred where you turn up a contract with a Lockheed Martin or a Fluor Corporation, namely the listed manufacturers that the Nuclear Free Tacoma Park has provided to the city reliably, either with a subscription service with MSCI, or more recently where we came up with and recommended that the city basically sign up for the free service through the International Committee to Prohibit Nuclear Weapons, and through the Don't Bank on the Bomb publication that comes out regularly. And that's what you've been using since, I believe, about 2010. So we have been participating with the city to provide the listing services. And also, I think that the outcome of this task force is in part due to the engagement that the committee has had over the years with the city to look towards a responsible approach to banking services and investment. But clearly, the task force that you impaneled had far more expertise than the Nuclear Free Tacoma Park Committee ever had. So I think that was the right choice. But nevertheless, we had a role as the committee with this outcome. So I do beg to differ that there's no record of our interaction with the city council in service to the Nuclear Free Zone Act, which we are an advocate for. And that I think most clearly comes to light by the fact that repeatedly the committee has advocated for the city and the Nuclear Free Zone Act to the point that the city council and the Nuclear Free Zone Act has gained national and international attention. So again, I don't think it's fair to say that there's no record if you look at the forest of activity that the committee and the interaction between government and civil service has accomplished on this very complicated issue. So I do believe that there is an opportunity for the committee to work in support of the recommendation that the city undertake a review of the taxonomy of nuclear power, and that it broadly look at the issue more than just an investment, but again, in the context of the Nuclear Free Zone Act and climate change, where it should be as much of a concern to understand that and I'll close on this note here, that that the record that we see, particularly since 2006 for nuclear power, where the announcement of the nuclear renaissance, which was received a lot of congressional support, streamlining of the licensing process, production tax credits from the federal government at the taxpayer expense. And of the 31 reactors plus that made application to the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission for licensing applications, only 2 after 15, 16 years are still under construction, and they're, double their original cost, even more for these are the Vogtle 3 and Vogtle 4 reactors under construction in Georgia, where they were projected.
Mr. Gutner, I really appreciate this. I think tonight we are not going to decide the pros and cons of nuclear power, but I do appreciate this, and there will be a time where I think we'll get into that more. But I do think I want to get back to the recommendations, the other recommendations.
And again, I would just request that that you do consider the Nuclear Free Committee would participate in any such recommendation. Yes. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
So I think this is the last thing we have. It's continuation of work.
Mm-hmm.
And my extemporaneous thing is these guys are awesome. And they're really, really smart. And as we dug into this whole thing, it really became clear that this is a lot of work and we're putting a lot of thought and work onto you all. And the light bulb went on. We were like, holy shoot.
We are broadcasting, so be careful.
We don't stop here, right? Yeah. The recommendations, there's a lot of implementation, there's a lot of thought that needs to go on. And our thought was, it may be appropriate, whether temporary or permanent, is to have a sustainable banking and investment task force committee to help any sort of implementation or thought that is needed. any of my colleagues here would be absolutely smart and brilliant to be on that, but I'm sure there's a lot of other folks and inappropriate demographics to discuss that. Because the nuclear-free stuff was added into this, so kind of there's a sustainable banking and now nuclear thing, we weren't sure if there was an opportunity that maybe the two committees would be combined as an option. There was a recommendation of, well, maybe some of the tasks of the nuclear free could move over, or maybe the whole committee could be moved into one. I think there's options going forward, but I think we only brought that up because our task was to look at both, and we thought you found some commonality that you wish to look at. But looking at the sustainable banking and investment, we think that a longer term committee would be appropriate, and we would absolutely help you implement as needed.
Great.
I think that's it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for that presentation and all the work. I think all of us received the report ahead of time. For members of the public, the report is up on the city website at our agenda. And I'm going to turn it over because I'm sure my colleagues have some questions and comments that we'll spend a little time on. Does anyone want to kick us off with any questions? Don't be shy, Councilman Searcy.
I'll go first. So one question I have is about volatility around the ESG status of like various institutions, or volatility in terms of like any kind of investment funds. Like, is it something easy, for example, a company to have an acquisition that then causes them to lower certain factors, and how often does that kind of happen?
So we do cite a few studies in the report that talk about the performance of ESG funds over time, that gets at the volatility point, in that some of the ESG aligned funds perform as well as some of the other popular funds. But it is a concern, and as you get more specific about ESG criteria, there is the risk of having too narrow of a portfolio that you're looking at. But what we're recommending here is kind of the broad assessment of companies' holistic performance on ESG, and looking at ESG labeled products and services. Like, does that answer your question?
It does. It helps, because I was just wondering, like, for example, if we were to say move forward with a bank or a financial institution that has currently a good ESG kind of, they incorporate a lot of the factors that the criteria that we want, but then, maybe next year, I'm just trying to figure out, like, if we make a substantial change, that could be a pretty substantive change towards an organization. What is the real possibility that something could change? I mean, you can never predict the future, but how volatile is it that someone can acquire, Truist, for example?
Oh, sure. Yeah. In terms of banks, and this is something I think we discussed briefly as a group, and it does happen. If anyone else would like to comment on that, you're welcome. But, and two, in terms of the bank that is if the choice is made to select a new bank, there are certain standards that should be upheld by it. And, in our discussions, there was a preference for something that's local too. So all of that should be considered, but welcome if anyone else has.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And, obviously, like, changing a financial service provider is a big undertaking, and you would hope it would be a long-term relationship. I would say that if a financial institution has gone forward with the process of developing some kind of an ESG policy that the city finds resonates, with its own policy, and through this kind of competitive RFP process, the city selects it. I think it's in theory that ESG policy that the institution has developed was, approved by its board and its shareholders. And as such, I would think it would be like a fairly long-term commitment that would, that it couldn't willy-nilly change quickly, you know? So I'd be surprised if, you know, say a few years from now, Tacoma Park changed its financial services provider to another bank, and the bank had an ESG policy that like next year the bank would renege on its ESG policy. I think that's very unlikely, given that these kinds of policies are things that these financial service institutions, you know, their shareholders back it, their board approves it. So it's kind of its own internal governance process to adopt it. Hopefully that answers your question.
No, that's perfect. You all hit both aspects, from the volatility of the funds as well as the likelihood of companies kind of doing an about face. So thank you so much. This is great.
Great. Councilman Costick.
Well, first of all, thank you. It's clear from reading the report and hearing from you tonight that this was an incredible amount of work. And I also found it incredibly accessible as I was going through the report too, which I think is a huge accomplishment. So thank you all very much. I guess one of the things that was kind of running through my mind as I was thinking through this is our position as a small city versus kind of some of the larger cities. And I know there's a chart at the end that kind of lists out some of the cities that have adopted policies, and some of them seem to be sort of smaller scale cities. Some are much larger cities. And I'm wondering, particularly with the RFPs or with the RFP concept for banking, you know, it's a fair amount of money, but it's not, you know, we're not a huge city. So do you think we can anticipate a lot of interest in sort of competing for our business, given that this is, there are some serious requirements that we'd be looking at putting in place there. Do you have any sense of whether that's something that there would be interest in pursuing?
Hi, thank you all very much for listening to us and taking our presentation. I'm Mike Ashford, I'm the vice chair. I worked on various pieces of this, but we all got pretty in the weeds. I think, you know, we did think about the size of the city in respect to both the investment policy and other recommendations of whether or not, you know, Tacoma Park is going to move the needle on anything. And I think it's really more about what does the city want it for itself. So in the sense that it could really seed change, perhaps at the state level, by working with other cities and influencing the Maryland pool, is a real opportunity by essentially leveraging the policies and objectives with like-minded cities, so you'd have a bigger impact. Then there was other considerations on how to really sort of craft the ESG and whether you divest or not, and that's where we did leave aside the issue of nuclear power for now, but there was a healthy debate and a lot of discussion about that. But as regards the procurement, I wouldn't underestimate the interest of some new banks, community banks, local banks, combined with their ability to leverage apps and other new access for employees, and sort of in the financial services world, sort of the liquidity of payroll and things like that. You don't have to go to a payroll lender anymore to get cash on your phone if employees are using phones, if it's a direct deposit. So I think they would be, in some cases, more able to provide sort of targeted services for local staff and for the city. And they have an interest in getting a foothold in this market of helping local communities and smaller clients, but still institutional clients, achieve their ESG objectives. I think that's a real market that's evolving, and to the extent that Tacoma Park can find out through a procurement, you're essentially finding out. It would be a valuable exercise. And also, I think we stated it in there somewhere that this could be sequenced, so it's not as much of a shock to the system. I understand you're also going through
adoption of a new computer financial system. So I think some of this could be done in a way that allows you to sort of see how it works. You could take certain parts of it together with the finance department and move them over on the basis of an initial survey through a procurement. So I know that was a long-winded answer, but I do think it's an opportunity, even if we aren't necessarily going to shift all of the banking services. I think somewhat ironically, banks like Truist and others that are investing heavily in fossil fuels or doing other things that would be not necessarily in line with an ESG criteria are also trying to find sort of products for consumers and for clients like Tacoma Park, user ESG friendly products. But it's a little bit hard to disassociate that from what the larger bank is doing. So I think the smaller banks that are focusing on that and trying to really build a niche in that market would be happy to respond to an RFP. I hope so.
Yeah, thank you. That's incredibly helpful. And I appreciate that you've outlined so many kind of concrete steps to help us get there, because I feel like we've had some of these discussions in the past and it's been hard to sort of figure out what the next steps are. So to me, this is incredibly helpful. Thank you.
Great. Councilmember Smith, do you want to go next?
Thank you for the presentation. I have to say initially, I am in support of the ESG recommendations for investment. But one question that I have is, have you guys considered if it's practical for the city to completely divest from Truist rather than going out with an RFP for another financial institution? Does it make sense for the city of Tacoma Park to create its own credit union? Thank you.
So you guys were ready for that question.
There has been discussion about different types of banks and credit unions. It is actually pretty difficult to get a credit union charter. It's not something that is done quickly. I'm not sure which screen I'll look at. Sorry, you're right here. It's a process, and things that you have to look at is, how, if you're going to become a de novo, an initial credit union, you have to have a certain amount of capitalization. So you have to have a certain amount of assets to be able to then start services. And so I unfortunately do not know the capital requirements of a credit union, but if it's anything, similar to a bank, I think the minimum is, I think, $10 or $25 million you have to put into it. So I think the process is available if you want to consider it. But I think looking at the capitalization, taking that money out of whatever pot it's in, put it into the credit union where it really can't be touched, it's used as reserves. That has usually been the most difficult hurdle to overcome before a credit union. You can become more of a, and I think if it's a city credit union, has different requirements or responsibilities than if it's a faith-based credit union or something smaller. So as a city requirement, it would be difficult to establish and lengthy if you do it.
So would it be any different if it was a fintech credit union, or it would be the same requirement if it was the traditional brick and mortar credit union?
Yeah, so fintech meaning could you help define? Would that
online. It'd be primarily online.
Yeah, so there are branchless banks, branchless credit unions but the requirements, capitalization, everything still holds true. So if you were interested, as previously discussed about, whether or not you want to do a local bank or there's other banks to consider, there are banks that essentially have no branches. And so you do have the ability to take a bank, that actually most branchless banks headquarters are either in Delaware or Salt Lake City. And then you could obtain the services, but it'll be wholly online. And then their products and services are quite user-friendly. They have to be because they don't have a branch, but they do allow an overlay of their services onto existing banks. And so, for example, Ally Bank has relationships with other banks where if you had a check from Ally, you can go to another bank, have it cashed, and then any kind of fees would be returned by Ally Bank. And same thing where with a branchless bank, if you have an ATM card, you can go to any other bank, pull money out of it, and then up to like $10 or $20, whatever the terms of the agreement are, they, that user would be have those associated fees returned. So, I think there's ways to look around on a fintech bank or as a branchless bank.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Councilmember Smith and Councilmember Kovar.
Thank you very much. And I do want to thank the members of the task force for an excellent report and a good presentation this evening. Thank you. Very professional, very helpful to us. And I'd say I agree with most of the recommendations. It seems to me they're in kind of three buckets. There's some where City Council really would have to work on, do we want to have this ESG requirement for our banking investments, for example? If we're going to put out an RFP for a new bank, we'd have to work on that. And certainly there's some issues to work out concerning nuclear power and the existence of the and work of the Nuclear Free Committee. So those are things that we would need to work on. I would like to see us personally have the ESG requirement and to move toward putting the RFP out. And I think two separate committees, one, the Sustainable Banking Committee that could kind of pick up on the work that the task force has done, and then a continuation of the Nuclear Free Committee, but only if we really are able to recruit a good, diverse, active membership there. But then there are other aspects of what's been recommended that don't require us to enact major changes as much as just to put in some requests. So certainly we could ask our existing CD broker whether they can do this. We could contact, move toward the ESG and CDs. We could contact our state legislators and as an initial step with regard to the Maryland local government investment pool and see if they're open to helping us figure that one out. And we could, I don't know if there's going to be an upcoming presentation. I think we sometimes get them, I'm not sure if it's annual, from the police pension fund representatives, but we could do a letter to them asking them about that. So I think there's the policies we could adopt. There's the question of the existence of these committees, and then there's steps that sort of fall short of that. But I think it's a great report, and I would really like to see us start moving in those directions. One thing that I had mentioned to members of the task force, and I think maybe we could get this information separately, is several of the jurisdictions and communities that are cited as having taken on policies of this sort, they're big places, big cities, states, some of them are places I've lived in, et cetera. But I know on the list, I've noticed on the list that there's some smaller places, some smaller than us too. So I do worry a little bit about staff bandwidth and capacity. So it would be interesting to get some more information about what some of these smaller places have done, just to see if that provides a additional helpful pathway forward to us. And I will say, I'm not assuming that even if there's agreement among my colleagues in moving forward on some of these things, we can do them immediately because there's a lot going on here. But I'd like to see us move forward. I think it's in line with the things we've talked about in the context of our climate framework and other discussions we've had. And so again, I just want to express my appreciation for the work of the task force and my hope that we can start to make some progress in these areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Kovar. Councilmember Siemens.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to let you know how impressed I am with the work of this task force. I really appreciate the report that you've given. I certainly support in general the recommendations that you've made. And I hope that you each will consider allowing the council to reach out for additional guidance and assistance as we look into each of these recommendations and try to implement them. Just thank you so much for your work.
Councilmember Devala.
Yeah, thank you very much. This has been very satisfying to me to hear such detailed, concrete recommendations in such a short time. I'm very impressed. And I agree with, I support most of the recommendations, and I'd like to see us move ahead also. It seems to me like the two of the areas that Councilmember Kovar identified, the moving ahead on, I'm not sure who I should be looking at. I guess I'm going to look at it at Ms. Clark. The moving ahead on changing the policy and proceeding with, what it would take to implement an RFP, because that's not a small task. So, and then out of those two, I would, not right now, but I would like to hear what the city management and finance director think about continuing a committee in order, whether that would help or whether that I'm thinking it would help. I was impressed with what I heard tonight, and I had not dreamed that you all would be willing to continue to do this. So I did have two questions. So the logistics of changing banks, it's in here in the report a bit about what that would take, because it's not a small task. Is there anything else that you all want to add that isn't written in here about not the logistics of writing an RFP, but actually changing banks, like doing it in sequence, doing it partially, doing it over time? I see a shaking head over here. And then while you're thinking about the answer, my second question has to do with the intriguing possibility of the Maryland Local Government Investment Pool. Is there any kind of model policy language that some other state or some other group has used to get a group of pension fund investments to line up under ESG criteria? So it's not just starting from, we want to, here's an idea, but we can say, here's an example. So those are my two questions.
Yeah, maybe I'll take those.
Great.
Because, frankly, on both of those issues, on the practicalities of changing banks and on what can be done with the Maryland Local Government Investment Pool, we really didn't have time to get into it in the way that would be needed. I mean, they're both, the first one is more of a practical issue, but the second one is also a theoretical issue. You've got all this money, but how should it be invested? I mean, we didn't even really start thinking about that.
Okay.
So I think that's it, especially on the second one, maybe shows why you might benefit from a continuation of, from a new committee. And by the way, I don't think we agreed, or any of us agreed to serve on this committee. Sorry, but maybe some of my colleagues would like to. But essentially, this is further work that needs to be done. And we just didn't have time in the short window that we had to really get into it. But there is, by the way, we did find the RFP from Los Angeles. And that one, and it's somewhere, it's buried in one of the footnotes, but obviously we would have a much more simplified version of it, but at least there's a model that we could start from there. So
Actually, if I wanted to follow up, Victor, don't go away. I have a question for you. If you're done, Councilman Deval. I wanted to follow up on the Maryland Local Government Investment Pool, and it hadn't occurred to me until you all were presenting tonight to make change. Who authorizes changes to that? Is that state legislatures? Would that be? The reason I ask is because each year in a few months, we propose legislative actions to the Maryland Municipal League. And, this may not be adopted the first time, but if we actually want to see this change made, this could be a place where we start recommending it to the Maryland Municipal League to take up and start helping to educate our colleagues in municipalities across the state.
Yeah, again, my sense is that it might it might require some legislation.
Mhm.
And, I was actually looking at some of the legislation, and it was so obscurely drafted that I couldn't even understand what it actually means
Mhm.
today. So,
Yeah.
it just is going to require a lot of work and discussion, but maybe putting a placeholder there that we're going to start looking at this might be appropriate. But the thing is that it's so complicated because you've got state law, and you've got the treasurer's office, and you've got all these municipalities. So I think it's just going to take a lot of discussion with people, maybe even just some initial meetings and brainstorming.
Yeah.
So it's not so simple. In other words, it's not an obvious thing like, oh, we want to do this.
Mhm.
It's more complicated than that,
Mhm.
unfortunately.
Well, for the Maryland Municipal League, we are able to suggest actual legislative action items and then areas like of concentration. Like, for example, this year, the league took up global warming as, what do we call it? Is it an area of?
It was originally an area of study.
Thank you.
And then this year they actually took positions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this might be something we recommend and can get the ball rolling.
Yeah, I mean, you could put it on the agenda,
Yeah.
essentially.
Yeah. Great. Just following up from what Councilwoman Dabala had asked is, at this point, is there any reactions from city staff to the recommendations, or are you all still digesting it as well?
We're still reviewing some of the recommendations that the committee proposed. We've looked at over the last couple of months,
Mhm.
particularly at the banking piece and RFPs. Our finance director has already engaged with other localities and looking at that. So, but we'll be diving more into each of the recommendations and seeing next steps, what we need to do, move forward.
Great, thank you. Well, I actually like to move forward and put two suggestions on the table for my colleagues. One is that sometimes when we get reports from task force, we just receive the report, we thank you, and we move on. We sometimes implement, but actually for this one, as Councilmember Kovar said, there's a lot of interest and agreement with the large majority of the recommendations that have been made. I would actually like to propose that council draft a resolution and adopt a resolution affirming some of the recommendations and wanting to move forward with that. As Councilmember Kovar said, some of these are going to take a while. And even though it is only April, I'm also very conscious of the fact that time sometimes goes quickly. And so to sort of immortalize that this city council received this report in the task force and agreed with the large majority of the recommendations, I'd like to propose that we actually have a resolution to do that.
Are
Right?
you
And I think
asking for-
Councilmember Dabala has already volunteered to write it.
I was about to say, are you asking for a
Volunteer.
subcommittee of folks to
And
work
you're
on
gonna-
this? And I would be happy to be one of
All
them,
right.
yes.
Good. All right, you're right. And then the next thing was I'm going to request that the subcommittee that worked on committees, which was Councilman Dabala, Caustic, and Searcy, look at where we are with the nuclear free committee and come back from a recommendation on moving forward, because I believe we have, if I'm correct, frozen the recruitment of members. So you only have 4 now, I believe. Is that 3? Only 3. And so if you all could look at the recommendations, what Mr. Gutner said tonight, and then come back to the council with a recommendation on how to move forward with that committee. All right, does that work for everyone? Councilmember Smith, Councilmember Kovar, I see Councilmember Kovar, thumbs up. All right, so we will, Councilmember Smith is nodding, move forward to draft a resolution on this. You may hear from some of us to clarify some points, and then come back with the recommendation for the nuclear free committee, obviously working closely with them on doing that. Sound good? Excellent. Well, thank you all. And we got you out of here before 9:30. So very much appreciate all your work on this. All right. That concludes that presentation. Did you have something else? Okay. Now we will turn it over to the city manager for the recommended FY 2023 budget.
Okay. Let's see here. Okay. Good evening, Mayor, members of council, residents, and staff. This evening, I stand before you in this body for the first time to present the city manager's recommended budget for fiscal year 2023. I will share budget highlights from the budget book that we had posted online for residents' review and council's review. We have taken a different approach this year and perspective on how we develop the budget. For example, we compared the proposed 23 against the projected 22 in an effort to better align actuals and provide a realistic budget figures, as well as we were able to automate some of the budget process through programming that was built by Mr. Powers in my office. Tonight, I'm pleased to have the entire senior leadership team, some here in person and the rest online. And I want to publicly thank them for their hard work. This leadership team has been very collaborative. They have helped me get up to speed on the operations and engaged in long hours and many weekends to be able to put together this year's recommended budget. We started this budget cycle with budget projections that concerned us. I requested from staff a 9% departmental reduction citywide. And in most of those departments, because we have some departments that are not as big as others, it was hard to get to that 9%. So some of the larger departments provided a little bit more to help us get somewhat close to our goal. Our goal was to minimize any potential workforce reductions and revenue loss. My leadership team was able to reduce their budgets collectively by approximately $3 million in the general fund. Some of those reductions were finding a different funding source to limit the impact on our general fund. We developed a list of necessary operational improvements that we call our wish list. These items were not able to be added in the proposed recommended 23 budget. And it does not look like we'll be able to add those wish list items in out years until we're able to reach one of our goals of a truly balanced budget where revenues equal our expenditures 1-to-1. To make progress on long-term financial sustainability, the recommended budget has funding for contractual services to help us for financial forecasts for the next 5 to 10 years and can assist this council and future councils with your budget deliberations. My leadership team is very resilient and had to endure 2 budget processes this year. The ARPA process, where we proposed 2 gigantic documents of 140 pages that showed inventory project lists, as well as the recommended spending plan that we worked with council that you all adopted back in January. Well, back in early April. Within the recommended budget spending plan, we also included the 5-year spending plan for ARPA in the budget book. This year, council will be faced with tough decisions, ones that will impact the future of our community. Our goals in building the recommended budget were to have a fiscally sustainable and service-oriented government while continuing to mitigate COVID-19 impacts and focus the organization on long-term sustainability. We do, however, in 23 have a lot of exciting projects on the horizon. From all the ARPA projects that you know so well, to launching a new website with a responsive citizen 311 relationship management system, to launching 2 new and critical organizational systems, our Human Resources Information System and our financial software upgrade with an interactive and user-friendly online budget platform. Just to name a few. Tonight, I will cover some highlights in the fiscal year 23 recommended budget. I'll talk a little bit about the vision, go into operating, touch on some capital project highlights, and then dive into the fiscal outlook and discuss tax investment. This past year has been very challenging for both the community and the city as we've been responding and managing to the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that the pandemic is still ongoing with new variants layered on top of increasing inflation that is impacting our service delivery and operations. But I want to lift up and recognize the dedicated and hardworking staff that work for the city. We know that these past few years have taken on a toll, but I want to thank them for continuing to give 100% each and every day. I also want to thank the council for making staff investments this past fall to recognize the hard work of our employees through additional hazard pay through ARPA, $3,400 to frontline staff, one-time end-of-year bonus of $2,500 to all staff, and a total of 3% and a wage adjustment. The recommended 23 budget is forward-looking as we try to re-normalize our lives through community events and safe gatherings, which has been non-existent these last few years. We are focusing on the organization's general fiscal health while making critical investments into the future. So that's what we mean by planning for a strong and resilient future by investing in our community. So my vision when I worked with staff and we started developing a budget, there was a couple priorities. Make sure that we remain committed to city council goals and priorities while stabilizing the organization and strengthening our goal of long-term financial sustainability. Expanding on services to our most vulnerable and historically underserved populations. Strengthening community partnerships that add value, and make sure that we're equitable in how we do community engagement and outreach. Our budget approach has and will continue to be to look forward to a balanced budget by prioritizing essential and core departmental functions, seeking revenue generation opportunities and increase our revenue, mitigating any unfunded mandates or potential liabilities, reducing costs where there are alternative service providers, and minimizing workforce reductions. So in fiscal year 23, there's 6 main goals of the city council priorities that we're going to continue to meet and exceed. And is always on the forefront of our minds in everything that we do, every project, every initiative, every conversation, and it's woven as you've seen through ARPA, and it's woven through the budget. The budgetary and financial goals. Tacoma Park has many demands on its budget. One level of service delivery is important. We want to provide more service, sufficient staff, sufficient resources where we have good roads, and a safe and livable community for all, where people can live, work, invest, and play in our community. We need to provide adequate services to the community and avoid where possible reductions of services. That will be hard to accomplish if we continue our current practice of tapping into our unassigned fund balance or rainy day reserve. We must protect that rainy day reserve if we want to perform well financially, meaning maintaining a structurally balanced budget where ongoing expenditures are funded by ongoing revenues, allowing for more growth of our unassigned fund balance. Council's 17% policy only allows the city to survive for 2 months if there is a catastrophic event that ever occurs. So we want to fund and sustain city services provide the financial resources, and ensure our fiscal sustainability in the future. Here, I want to just recognize and lift up our finance department, our finance director, Deputy City Manager, Ms. Clark, and many others, senior leaders, where we were able to be awarded early this year this GFOA Distinguished Budget Presentation Award, where we had to meet certain guidelines, which are designed to assess how well our budget serves as a policy document, a financial plan, a operations guide, a communications device, and we're one of 1,700 participants in that budget award program, and we're very proud of the hard work of our finance team and other staff, and we're looking forward to getting this again in this next budget year. Next few slides, I'm going to provide just a high-level overview of the budget. So here, I took out of the budget book just so you can see that our total revenue of all funds is right around $41.6 million. Our expenditures, so in previous slides, when I talk about expenditures outpacing revenues, our expenditure is projected at $49.1 million. Our general fund is 27.8. As far as revenue, and general fund expenditures is 34.8. So when you look at all funds, and particularly a general fund, that's where you see the deficit of 6.9 million between the 34.8 million in expenditures and 27.8 million in revenues. But if you back out our library bond reserve of $5 million, our true deficit as an organization is 1.981. Here in this budget here, so our major funds consist of 5 primary funds: a general fund, special revenue fund, speed camera fund, stormwater fund. And here, just wanted to show our expenditures by those funds, where you look at the general fund makes up basically 71% of the expenditures. And then when you look at the expenditures by type, personnel makes up 43% of the expenditures by type. So we look at major funds and revenues. When you look at property tax, which is revenue per the constant yield formula from the state, which in fiscal year 23, we're projected to receive about $539,000 or an increase of 3.9%. We look at intergovernmental, which that also includes some of the tax duplication funds that we will receive in 23, which is about $5.1 million. That also would include in future years, the mayor touched on in her remarks earlier this evening about the highway user revenue funds that we'll receive in fiscal year 24. The income tax, which is 17% of income tax that would otherwise go to Montgomery County. This amount has been increasing. So when you see here, our total revenues is 41.6, where majority of it's in taxes and utility and fees. So here is, it's just outlined. So 95% of the general fund revenue main sources between property tax, income tax, and intergovernmental revenue, 95% of the city's general fund is made up of those sources. And when you look at it, real property taxes equate for around 53%. Intergovernmental is about 29%. Income tax is about 13%. And then charges for service is around 5%. And so you can see since 2014 actuals, it has been increasing. Real property revenue has been increasing through this past adopted year 22. Here, I just wanted to just show that we do have other funds, revenues, a speed camera fund, where we had $1 million in fiscal year 22, projected to be 1.9 due to the addition of the red light cameras that council adopted at last meeting. Stormwater fund, thanks to the implementation of our new fee structure and cost management year over year, this fund has moved from a projected deficit in 22 to a projected surplus in 23. And kudos goes to Director Braithwaite and the great work that she's been doing over there in Public Works. Our special revenue fund expenditures 4.9 exceed revenues 2.3, and this fund is due to $2.5 million in cable grants. And then the infusion of ARPA. We received our first tranche this past July of 8.7. We'll receive the next tranche this come July in 23. Now, on the next couple of slides, I'll go into a little bit more of the budget highlights that we have. So this budget is very similar to previous budgets. It's baseline budget, maintenance of effort, budget for all departments due to our limited revenues. The ARPA fund provides some expansion of services and new initiatives in fiscal year 23. Departmental and non-departmental budgets are largely maintenance of effort. There's some increases in the general fund that reflect a return to pre-pandemic levels as opposed to an expansion of services. And here on the next couple of slides, I want to just share, because we all should be very proud of your tax dollars at work and the services that the men and women in this organization provide to the residents of this community. We have a full service police department and include crossing guards, neighborhood code enforcement is actually relocated from the police department and has moved to housing and community development. Rent stabilization and other affordable housing initiatives like down payment assistance program, tenant services advocacy, where we have city contracts with county for code enforcement for multifamily buildings. City provides direct assistance to tenants to create tenant associations, parking enforcement and management. Public works services include sidewalk repair, tree and canopy protection, tree maintenance, right-of-way maintenance, landscaping, gardens, stormwater and erosion control, civil engineering services, construction project management, snow removal, electronic recycling drop-off, sustainability and energy efficiency programming, recreation programming services, includes sports leagues, summer camps, scholarships for low-income residents and seniors, funding free camps, free summer camps and summer programs for our teens, which is one of the key constituents that we're focused on in the community post-pandemic. Advancing racial equity, the library and the extensive collection of print and digital resources for all ages, associated programming, the literacy programming, ESL, French language programs that our library team provides, childcare programs for before and after care in the recreation department, maintenance of city parks, pavilions, and athletic fields, city festivals, parades, and events like Celebrate Tacoma, the Monster Bash, Egg Hunt that's coming up soon, Independence Day, etc. Community grants and partnership programming to provide funds for area service providers to address issues like food scarcity, youth success, and other recreation programming. Services that we also have increased through ARPA, public arts and humanities programming, communication, city TV, we're online and cable programming, broadcasting, the city newsletter, maintenance of the website, social media, legislative advocacy at the county and state levels, administering local elections. We have election this year coming up, which is extended voting rights, 16 and 17-year-olds, support for resident boards and commissions, You gave an incentive to those who serve on those boards and commissions in the last fall. Support for local business associations to promote amenities in the city. Internal services from IT, which supports outward facing technology, HR, finance, legal. Emergency funds to help residents who may need one-time support to pay rent, buy food. Tree fund assistance, meeting rooms and other public spaces, including our community labs, media center, art room, senior room, teen lounge, game room, and we also provide passport services and notary services. We should be very proud of the services that we do provide to our residents. Now I want to touch on enhanced service delivery. This builds on the changes made in fiscal year 22. The city provided a 3% wage increase, and as I stated, the $2,500 one-time bonus for all staff, as well as the $3,400 bonus funded through ARPA for frontline staff. In fiscal year 23, I'm recommending council to increase wages to 5%. That 5% is made up 2.7% cost of living adjustment, which is the ECI, as well as the 2.3% margin for further wage adjustment, but no increases on performance again this year. Benefits, health benefit costs remain flat. Workers' compensation increased by 34%. We have personnel, I wouldn't say new personnel, but full-time, well, outside of ARPA, full-time positions in city increased by 4. We have 3 new administrative positions, all funded through ARPA, as well as an HR coordinator funded by the general fund and approved by council last July. The rest of the FTE increase reflects an increase in hours for our seasonal and part-time positions in public works, recreation, and the use of library supplemental assistance. And then restructuring. The Neighborhood Service Division and the Police Department is now split between 2 departments. Parking enforcement remains with the Police Department, while code enforcement functions have been moved from the Police Department to the Housing and Community Development Department. We are recommending several key investments in 23. Financial forecast, as I stated, migration to the new website, constituent request system, implementing training for a comprehensive HRIS system, Human Resource Information System. The next city council election will take place in November, and full cost of the election administration are included in the city clerk and legislative division budgets. Replacement of the city's phone system. The legislative division includes funding for stipends for council-appointed boards and committees. And this just shows, as I keep talking about ARPA tonight, the 17.5 spending plan that council adopted, you invested $13 million in the community, and you've invested $4.4 million in city operations, which is great because it goes to the people in the community that need it. And the social services partnerships, we've already provided information on some of those projects to you. Most of the other projects that staff is working hard on, we'll be bringing forth to you in the coming weeks and months to give you updates on where we are. In the fiscal year 23, we are recommending to continue investing in community partnerships through housing and community development, recreation, and library departments. Here are a few community partnerships, $103,005 for economic development service contracts, lunch and learn, $45,000, Independence Day, $20,000, $15,000 for the folk festival, $10,000 for community play, and $5,000 for Montgomery College scholarships. Several community investment programs typically are funded out of the general fund will be covered by ARPA, and the budget book reflects those general fund reductions concentrated on interdepartmental section. Here is we're continuing those same investments. When you look at $200,000 for Tacoma Park Cooperative Nursery School Grant, $175,000 for the Washington McLaughlin School Grant, 6530 and 6600 New Hampshire Ave revitalization, 500,000 there. So just wanted to show particularly those funds coming from special revenues, other investments that the fiscal year 23 budget will include. Now, I want to turn our focus and I want to touch on some highlights on the capital budget over the next several slides. So our 5-year capital improvement plan, CIP, covers fiscal years 23 through 27. Have a life of 5 years or greater. It costs $5,000 or more. And they include equipment replacement, information communication technology improvements, park development, infrastructure improvements, facility improvements, and stormwater management. Here on this slide, we're recommending investing about $12.3 million in capital improvement expenditures in fiscal year 23. And you can see them broken out by department on the left side. And then on the right side, you see that the pie chart where 61.1% is police, and the next largest fund is 20.1% public works. So over the next few slides, I'll highlight some of those recommended projects in 23. So for the equipment replacement, we're looking at $447,615 for 7 police vehicles, $6,000 for electric bike maintenance, $83,373 for a roll-off trailer, keeping our city clean and sustainable, $48,439 for aerial lift, trimming trees and installing the leaf boxes, $78,136 for the recreation bus, where we use very heavily transporting our residents and safely, $30,000 for improved IT server security, maintaining strong cybersecurity. And the infrastructure improvements, you already know the $7.5 million library renovation for our state-of-the-art library for our residents, $510,000 for ADA sidewalk retrofit to improve quality of life for all residents, $400,000 street rehab for street repairs and pothole fixes, $300,000 new sidewalk design and traffic calming, increasing the safety and walkability of our city, and $170,000 for public space and transportation, where we have bike infrastructure, bus shelters, and public land improvements. Our facilities and stormwater with $1 million for the atrium floor, completing the lower level of the community center through ARPA. $250,000, the Tacoma Branch Stream Restoration Phase 2, restoring and improving the environment. $40,000 for HVAC control system, improving the energy efficiency of the community center. Now I'd like to turn our attention to our fiscal outlook and tax rate. As we're planning for a strong and resilient future, that also means that we need to make critical investments to meet the needs of the community. The fiscal year 23 proposed tax rate, $56.97 per $100 valuation. Every cent invested is $267,293 in expected revenue. This chart shows to the right the tax investment or decrease in tax investment over the last 9 fiscal years. A tax investment of less than 3 cents will result in severe reduction in city reserves, fiscal instability, poor emergency position, cuts to personnel and programs, and there will not be any growth in our reserves. And when you look at the 3 cent tax investment recommendation, So on the bottom of the screen, we looked at homes around 623,400 average home here in Tacoma Park. At the 3 cent, it's an additional $313.31 per month. And then you look at the tax rate flat at the current rate at 53 is an additional $126.29. And the constant yield at 5195 is an increase in 36 cents. So why the tax investment proposed? Well, GFOA recommends that governments establish a formal policy that's maintained in general fund for GAAP and budgetary purposes. GFOA recommends at minimum that governments, regardless of size, maintain unrestricted budget fund balance in their general fund no less than 2 months worth. In Tacoma Park for fiscal year 23, that's about 4.7 million, 2.3 million per month. Our current unassigned fund balance is 2.8. 4.7 million is necessary amount to meet GFOA best practices, as well as the city council policy of 17% of revenue in the unassigned fund balance reserve. And this recommended fiscal year 23 budget, the true deficit in the budget is 1.981. Revenues have not kept pace with expenditures. In order to balance the budget and keep the city on a fiscally sustainable path long-term, ongoing city expenses must be supported by ongoing revenue, not one-time revenue sources. When total revenues do not keep pace with expenditures, it has been the case over the past several years here in the city that we continue to tap our unassigned general fund balance or rainy day fund. In order to balance the budget, we have to keep the city in a fiscally sustainable path long-term. The options for balancing the budget each year, no different this year. A, make cuts to the budget. In other words, reductions in personnel, reductions in service delivery, programming. B, identify new sources of ongoing revenue, increase property values, grants, etc. And C, increase tax rates. Those are the three key elements for us to be able to continue to balance our budget each and every year. The tax investment recommendation is I'm recommending to council to do 3 cent tax investment. The recommended budget reflects the continuation of existing delivery levels of service with the exception of ARPA. It's proposed, it still results in a 1.981 deficit in the general fund, excluding the 5 million in library bond reserves. And I put here 3 options, 3 additional options, council. So when you look at a 2 cent tax investment, that will take our reserves down to 2.3 million. The days of coverage only gets you 29 days. And then also additional reduction in the fiscal year 23 budget of 534,000. There's no growth in our unassigned fund balance. A 1 cent tax investment decreases the reserves to 2 million with an average stay of 25 days if there is a catastrophic issue in an emergency. Additional reduction of $800,000 in the fiscal year 23 budget. No growth in the unassigned fund balance. And if you decide to go with the constant yield, reserves significantly decreases to 1.5 million. The days of coverage that we will have will be 19 days. Additional reduction of the fiscal year 23 budget will need to be by $1.3 million. No growth in the unassigned fund balance. As an organization, we're at an inflection point, and the decisions that mayor, members of council, that you make this year will impact the next few years as we continue to work towards organization on long-term financial sustainability. There are tough decisions where you will need to weigh both the type of service delivery you expect for the community and the need to make organizational investments. Those investments are personnel and revenue relating to the tax rate investment you adopt. Depending on the option that I just covered with you, you determine this evening as we go through the next 7 weeks, it will mean not only the significant possibility of workforce reductions, but also potential programming reductions. Those reductions could also be the case for the next few fiscal years. Of course, it depends on many variables, but one thing for sure is that we cannot continue having our expenditures outpace revenues. And that's why I recommend that council invest 3 cents to the tax rate this year for fiscal year 23. This slide here shares our timeline for our continued fiscal year 23 budget discussions over the next 7 weeks. Next week, we'll be back here to hear public hearing on my recommended budget, with the goal of getting to May 11th, to have the first reading ordinance adopting the fiscal year 23 budget and tax rate, and then the second reading adopting the budget and tax rate on May 18th. Again, thank you to our amazing professional staff, my senior leadership team, and especially members of my interdepartmental budget team for their hard work in developing this year's fiscal year 23 budget. Deputy City Manager Clark, Finance Director Chung, Human Resources Director Smith, Housing and Community Development Director Cross, Budget and Accounting Manager Mr. Kowali, Communications Manager Ms. Wright, Public Administration Specialist Mr. Powers, Communication Specialist Mr. Allen. With that, Mayor, I turn it back over to you and council. Take any questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Fox, for that presentation. Councilmember Siemens, would you like to take us off?
I appreciate that. Thank you, City Manager Fox, for all the work that's obviously been put into this document and for your presentation tonight. You answered a lot of questions in your presentation, but I wonder if you could give kind of a Cliff Note summary of the significant reductions in the expenses that you're proposing in this budget.
As far as significant reductions that we're proposing?
Yes, you had said that there had to be some cutbacks in the expenses in each department.
So departments went through and as I stated early, this is a baseline maintenance of type of budget, and it made us uncomfortable, but departments dug in deep and made reductions that is equivalent to about $3 million in items that they would love to have continued. They either reduce those items in dollar amounts or reduce them totally from the budget. And
I think
most of those items you'll see before you in the fourth budget amendment on what those reductions were.
Okay, yeah, I think the community members and staff members are probably very curious about kind of where those reductions are being proposed.
Yeah, and I wanted to add that we also used about $1 million of ARPA to cover certain community investment programs that were previously covered by the general fund just for this fiscal year. We also moved a large portion of police department expenses to the new speed camera revenue. And we also dipped into cable grants for our communications division, or some of the other ways that we made reductions to the general fund.
Okay, thank you. We'll be watching for a detailed report on that as we go through this. Thank you.
It's probably in here, but I'm looking, if you could tell me where a summary of how much we have in each of the reserves, like the housing reserve, the emergency reserve, is in the budget book.
It's on page 34, Madam Mayor.
34. Got it. Thank you. I'm sorry, Councilwoman Searcy.
So I'm sorry, I'm listening and I'm frantically going through the book, trying to wrap my head around things. So it looks like there is a proposed increase in terms of FTE of 6.65 FTE. And it looks like about 3 of those FTE are proposed for ARPA related items. How does this budget, how did you all make decisions around, especially if we're operating at a deficit, around additional FTE? And 2, how are those FTE that are funded by ARPA actually accounted for in the budget? Are they accounted for under our general personnel costs? Is there some sort of separate fund in terms of how it's accounted for?
Yeah, so those covered on the ARPA came on the ARPA fund, and their wages, part of the personnel. The additional FTE are what we did this year is just capture the additional, like I said, from the library, from Public Works and other departments that have part-time and seasonal, where in previous years, we haven't included them into the FTE count. This year, we included them to provide the true actual FTE for their time that they work here.
And Councilor Searcy, I'll just add that we do have a separate section. So the ARPA fund is now a 5th fund. It's a major fund for the city. And we did create a separate section for that in the budget book on page 239, where we have the 5-year plan, and that's where those 3 positions are reflected.
And while we're on that, so you're saying that these pieces of FTEs for seasonal and part-time were somewhere else in the budget besides personnel? Or were they, I'm a little confused. So
It just reflects the increase in hours. They were previously in the budget, but we've increased the hours back to pre-pandemic levels.
Yeah, that was going to be the other part of my question. Or is it reflecting?
So that's where the 0.65, the increase is 6.65. So those will show in portions for each department. They're not one round number. Yeah.
It went down, now it's gone up because we're through the pan. Okay, thank you. That's much more clear. And while I'm on personnel, just a point of clarification. So the base amount of money that is needed for salaries going into this budget is 3% more than it was last year.
Correct.
Right.
It's
So
3%.
all those possible increases in that you on that slide, that's on a higher number than where we were last year, just to make it clear for me, the impact of the 3% that we gave this year ripples out through all the different years.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And just to add, so it's 3% that you provided last fall. And then for the 5% this year, and the 5%, the 2.7 and 2.3 is about $613,000.
Councilmember Smith.
Mr. Fox, and your team, I just want to thank you guys for putting this initial presentation for FY23 budget together. Obviously, a lot of hard work went into this. A lot of serious decisions were made. So I really thank you for that. Mr. Fox, you talked about in previous fiscal years, the tax rate was fairly low, and I guess to some extent that's why we were in this current situation. Can you just stress, I know you said it, but can you just stress once again what happens if we do not go forward with your recommended tax investment? That's an interesting phrase. I do say I appreciate that. What happens with programming, staffing levels at the city, and how would we come to those decisions? Would you and your team put together proposals for us? Would it just be across the board reductions? That's my first question. If we do go forward with your recommendation, we still have a deficit of $1.9 million. What is your proposal to make sure we meet that recommendation? Does that come from the reserves? Will there be some series of reductions in some other way? Will we take money out of ARPA? I don't know. I'm just putting those out there. And then finally, you spent a number of years on the West Coast. I grew up out west. Jurisdictions out there usually do 2 fiscal years at the same time. Can you just briefly talk about the benefits of that? And if we don't get this fiscal year right, how will or what will be the ramifications for FY24 and FY25? Thank you so much.
I was trying to jot down as you went. I'll try my best. You threw a lot of questions.
Thank you, sir.
I would say I'll start with the second question as far as reductions, whether in staff or programming. If depending on, as I stated, there are many variables, and it really depends on the options that which investment option that council goes with. And then we would have to, as a leadership team and staff, go back and look at what does that really mean to the bottom line. If there's any type of reductions, we would also need to refer to our HR policies, our CBA, collective bargaining agreement for our labor partners, because there are certain processes in place dictating what happens when, if there's any layoffs, any reductions. And then we would need to work with council to really talk about streamline what are those essential functions that we need as far as programming in the organization. What things can we stop doing, and really talk through what that looks like. As far as the tax investment, touching on your first question there, it's we're already using in 22 and 23, we're using the unassigned fund balance already. And with that 1.9 million, looking out years, the only thing that we could do is look at reducing the fiscal year 23 budget. But that will also touch on what I just started talking about, reductions in staff and programming. The impacts of this year, it will have some impacts in 24, 25, but we do know that we'll get the HUR funding in 24. We know that we'll get a little bit more money in tax duplication. And hopefully through staff work, hopefully we'll be in a better position, and maybe we get even more revenues coming in the next fiscal year. But I will say, just looking at where we are, 3 cent, 1.981 deficit, we'll be back here next year. And we'll probably have to do another exercise anyway if the 1.9 stands. There's a lot of variables that can happen in the fiscal year with revenues and other changes that we do organizationally. And the last question you had is about the benefits of the West Coast. I would just say that very blessed to have worked on the West Coast and learned some of their creative and progressive ideas. And I've taken on some of those during my time living on the West Coast.
Thank you, Mr. Fox. Excellent work.
Councilman Costick.
Thank you very much for the presentation and for all the work that I know has gone into this from the whole team. I just wanted to go back briefly to the personnel schedule. And I do think one of the things that I was just found the answer to my question here, which was about the ARPA positions being temporary ARPA funded positions versus long-term, permanent positions. I do think just as we're sort of looking at this, it's helpful to break that out. And so if we can just understand, I think that's 2.5 of the 3. Is that accurate?
No,
That's-
it's 3 of the
Three.
It is the 3.
Sorry.
Okay. I was just looking back, the narrative here says the net increase reflects creation of 2 full-time and 1 half-time temporary positions in the ARPA funded related programs. Is that?
What page are you on?
I'm on page 19. And
Thank you.
I don't need an answer right now, but if we can just kind of dig into that and make sure we have the correct, if it's 2.5 or 3 on that point. I think it does tell a different story if we're looking at 6.5 or so long-term commitment versus kind of the temporary positions. And then I guess my other question is more logistical in terms of me digging into this and coming up with a number of questions and things. I know in the past we've kind of lobbed a million things at you, Jessica. So just curious how you want us to go through and follow up on questions that we have as we're going through this.
If you have any questions on this, you can send it to myself and Ms. Clark.
Okay, great. Well, try to collect them all in one package. I know in the past I've sometimes sent a bunch here and there, but I will try to collect them in a standardized way. Thank you. I really appreciate all the work.
Councilwoman DeBala.
Yeah, thank you. I did, thank you for letting me have a round 2. Couple of bigger picture questions. So I'm thinking not, but did you consider whether a commercial property tax rate would be the same as a residential, or whether it would potentially be different?
It will be different. You wouldn't yield as much revenue on the commercial side.
So if we had a different commercial tax rate, property tax rate, it would be lower?
And I have to go back and follow up with our finance director. But we did look into the 2 different options.
Yeah, okay, so I'd be just curious at that. And I had been curious also about a little more specificity on the fiscal 22 reductions and how they're and how they're reflected in 23. So you said you asked everybody to reduce by 9%. And then does that go, what more specific, what Councilmember Seaman said, what more specifically is that, and how does that, and then my additional question is, how does that ripple through the fiscal 23? Are those temporary, or are they also in here? If that makes any sense as a question. Okay. And just one more general, one specific question. So in splitting up parking and code enforcement, is there any additional cost with that? Or is it basically, yeah, so
It's a
no
wash. It's-
additional management?
All it is,
whatever.
is just taking
Yeah,
that
and just-
portion of that vision and just
Okay.
taking it back to pre-2017 and HCD.
Right, and then along the program lines, so some of the programs in here I've noticed flipping through are already reduced pretty significantly. One example being the sustainability program. So what I would be curious about, rather than me having to flip through every single one of these pages, if one of you, not necessarily this moment, but if one of you already knows, like, what are the 5 big places where program money got cut, that would be helpful for us to know. And thank you for all of this work. And of course, I will have more specific questions, but I really appreciate this presentation. It was very clear.
Councilmember Kovar.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the presentation. I appreciate it. Since I'm remote, I don't have the book, and so I haven't been able to skim through it all while my colleagues have been talking. So I'll have some general questions, and we'll follow up with other points, and there'll be a lot of opportunities over the coming weeks. One of the questions I had was, and maybe Mr. Fox, you can just clarify that. I thought I heard you give a number that the proposed 5% increase in personnel was equal to, but I may have missed that. So would you mind just restating that, how much that is equal to?
613,000.
Okay, 613,000. So some of that, would you say, is it fair to say that at least some of that is driven by inflation that's connected to COVID and the responses to COVID? Is that a fair statement?
Of what I'm recommending at 5% with the personnel and
but that's a bigger amount than we've seen in the past, right? I mean, last year we had some increases, and this year previously it was smaller when this is a bigger increase than we've normally seen. Is that more or less true, would you say, compared to recent years?
I would have to follow up with our HR director and
Okay.
get that back.
In the last audit we had, and that was for the 2021 budget year, we're in the 2022 budget year, and this budget's for the 2023 budget year. So for 2021, and we had the audit in the fall, I guess, of last year. It showed at that point that the unassigned balance was a little over 7 million. And that was actually 28%. And I think when we discussed this a few weeks ago, when you made the fiscal health presentation, there was some indication that at least some of those funds, although they were in the unassigned reserve, they were at least earmarked potentially for future expenditures. So whether they were truly unassigned, I guess, is a separate question. But in that case, if it was at 28% and we had 7.1 million to get down to 17%, there's about 2.7 million that could be spent. And so I know this is a real more simplifying way of looking at it, but what would you say has changed between the 2021 fiscal 2021 time and now that has led to the unassigned reserves being lower?
Well, expenditures are higher. So expenditures in 22 and 23 proposed it's higher than the revenues. And so we had to use some of the unassigned to be able to balance the budget with the reserve.
And so for this year, I mean, this proposed budget, the one you presented now, so the unassigned reserves, they're in the general fund, right? They're not separate from the general fund. Is that right?
Yeah, you have that, and some of the unassigned general fund reserve is you have the designated amount, which we have to designate like we did in 22, 23 for the deficit amount where we actually take from and take from the reserve and to address the deficit. And then you also have transfers to reserves, like the housing fund that we're investing 100,000, like the ERR that we're investing money into. And so we also have those reserves that also comes. So let me see,
But they're not unassigned, right? Those are assigned reserves, right? They aren't in the unassigned category, right?
Yeah, but you have to take money from the unassigned to transfer to the assigned reserve amount.
So I guess my question is, if there's enough money in the unassigned reserve to cover the gap between revenues and expenditures, setting aside those library bond funds, with some left over. Maybe this is just a terminology thing, but I'm not clear why that's considered a deficit if we do have more money in the general for expenditure in revenues than we have for expenditures. Admittedly, not by as much as we want, but are we actually, is it actually a deficit or once we, it seems to me like once we include the unassigned funds, it's not a deficit. And maybe it's just a terminology question.
Yeah, and with that, I could, get you with our finance director and we can walk through that terminology to make sure that we're all on the same page on once you use some of the money of the unassigned, that adds to the deficit once you use it. But I'll follow up with the finance director and a few Councilmember Kovar.
Just one other question that I appreciate that you've taken, put your arms around the larger budget here and come up with a set of proposals. And now we're going to go into it. I do have some pause about the tax increase proposal, in part because even for people where it's where their assessments have been stable, that could be a challenge. But then given the, I think, uneven and in some cases quite substantial assessment increases that we've seen around the city, and I think it hasn't really been in a very clear pattern or trend way that's happened. It really would be a pretty substantial increase for some people. So if we're talking about not personnel reduction, but programmatic reductions to the degree that we can agree on some, that would enable the proposed tax increase to be reduced in a way that wouldn't tap any more deeply into the unassigned reserves. Is that a fair way to look at it?
What I would say is, if we look at, and this would be the will of council, the decision that you is, but if we look at programmatic reductions, some of those programs equate to people with those programs. So you're essentially also reducing staff capacity.
Okay, that's something to think about.
And the last thing I would say, just touching on and understand your reservation with the tax investment. But we also, in our budget in 23, as has been the case in previous years, there is funding and there are programs that we could assist people with, homestead abatement grant and resources that are at the county and state levels as well.
That's for low-income residents, right?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Appreciate it, Mayor.
Councilman Searcy.
Thank you for allowing me to have the round two. So one of the things that I'm struggling just a little bit is understanding how this budget accounts for the overlap between the ARPA funded items and the general fund. So for example, under ARPA, we received, I guess we are receiving funds for lost revenue, right? So when we're talking about that, one of the main reasons why we have this deficit is because we had lost lower revenues and expenditures, which happened during the pandemic. Where in the budget could I find how we are accounting for the ARPA dollars that are not necessarily program related, but due to the lost revenues? And how did that go back into the general fund?
So there was a transfer of the 1.1 million or so from ARPA to the general fund that was made in this fiscal year. But we're not doing any additional, just pure revenue loss reimbursement of the general fund. But we have taken, like I said earlier, about $1 million to cover, we're playing a bit of a shell game, right? So we had some community investments that we would normally cover, like our community grants program. We normally cover that with general funds. In this fiscal year, we're saying we have an ARPA allocation for that of about $300,000. Let's spend ARPA first before we spend the general fund. So we did about $1 million of like a shell game there to protect the general fund a little bit more in this fiscal year. But our ARPA manager can speak to this further, but we are going to pursue the $10 million standard allowance, which has replaced the previous revenue loss calculation. So that way, out of the full ARPA money that we have, the 10 million has a lot of flexibility in terms of how we can spend it. So although you all have already decided on how you want to spend the full 17.5 million, if in out years we are having financial difficulty, et cetera, you could cut some of the ARPA programs that you've decided on and like do more of a shell game if you'd like. And the standard allowance of 10 million gives us a lot of flexibility to do that.
Okay, yeah, because I think I'm kind of seeing the shell, which is the shell game that's being played, which is I just need a little bit more time, a lot more time. I mean, this thing is like 200 pages, like.
Yeah, and part of the reason we have to do the shell game is that you're not allowed to just use ARPA to just put it in your rainy day reserve, right? That's not an eligible use of ARPA. So we do want to use ARPA wisely in terms of what it's eligible for.
Right. And so for those basic pre-spends, because I saw in some of the ARPA fund tables, we basically had to front load our expenditures, right? So we planned all this stuff. We have to start doing the work in essence before we receive the tranche, right?
Yes.
So in this budget, are we, because it looks like we're showing the deficit for this fiscal year based on, the fact that we had to front load most of the ARPA projects in terms of the ARPA section.
Right, the using ARPA for certain general fund programs reduced the general fund deficit. Correct.
Okay. 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 All right. So that's helpful. And I'll send other questions forward, but I was just trying to wrap my head around the fact that we can use and we did receive, ARPA dollars related to the revenue losses. And so how does that kind of play into things when we're talking about a deficit associated with the revenue losses of the prior fiscal year or something? I'm trying to wrap my head around. Okay, thank you.
So that would be an example of the fiscal 22 and how it's playing out in 23. So I see in the ARPA section on page 247, I see that 1.1 million you're talking about. I don't know if it's broken down anywhere, but that would be useful to know. And then we could see how that plays out for 23, just as an example of something I asked earlier.
Sorry. Just a couple of things. Just to piggyback on, I think what Councilmember Kovar and Councilman Searcy were saying, it would be helpful to understand what we did in last year's budget in terms of using ARPA dollars for lost revenue versus dipping into reserves, because that is unclear at the moment in how it's represented here. Because I know we used ARPA dollars last year for lost revenue so that we didn't have to dip into reserves. but I'm having a hard time tonight following that conversation. So I think having more clarity on that would be great. And then I had a couple of questions on revenue that's come in this year, or things that we did not spend money on and where they're showing up. So for example, we had a state revitalization grant to support the acquisition of homes for $500,000. And I thought that was going into it should have been in our FY 2022 budget. That would have shown up in our housing reserve fund, but I'm not seeing it on page 34. And so I'm just curious where the $500,000 is. And if we did something with it or not, but where it's showing up in our budget. I know we did allocate some of the housing reserve funds this year on Hillwood Manor and some other things, but I'm pretty sure that money was supposed to be in the FY 2022 budget, and that was $500,000. In addition, there are a number of other things that are noted in the summary. The $462,000 we're getting in tax duplication, the additional income tax money that we didn't expect, and I believe we're supposed to also get the opioid fund settlement this spring, and whether or not that has been calculated at all.
It hasn't been calculated because we don't know
Because
how
we
much
don't know
we're
what
gonna
the
get.
money is going to be. Okay. We may know any day. Maybe it'll be a nice surprise as we do the budget. And in addition, any other items that particularly that were on the reconciliation list from last year that did not get funded this year. For example, council had voted for putting money into our racial equity officer, the navigator program, and other things that we've now kind of rolled over into the ARPA funds. So understanding where that money was budgeted last year, where it's gone this year. And I can type all this up.
And
send it to you.
some of that you'll see in the Amendment 4 that's coming in the next week or so.
All right, maybe it'll show up there. And then my final question is on the emergency reserve on page 34, it looks like we don't have an increase in it, but according to our city charter, don't we have to actually increase the emergency reserve every year by the CPI? That's just a question.
We can follow up on that.
Yeah. Not expecting answers tonight. It's the first night. I'm sure we'll have lots more, but those are just some things that popped out. And just to wrap up what Ms. Clark was saying before about the 10 million, actually that came up during the MMA conference, and we did have a presentation on the ARPA funds, and that was definitely the recommendation that is out there. So I'm glad, it was actually on my to-do list to ask you all, but glad to see that that is something that we're doing, because it does provide a lot more flexibility in terms of things. So hold on, I think. Good. Those are all my questions. I'm not seeing any others hands up. So I think for our first night, we're done. Congratulations. Your first budget. Very good. Thank you for the presentation tonight.
And
And,
can we say thank you to all of the department heads who apparently are hanging on?
Yes.
Virtually, and the one that's in the room.
Uh-huh. So yes, thank you to all the department heads. Congratulations to the city manager on the presentation of his first budget, deputy city clerk, and everyone else. And well, strap in, folks. We have 6 weeks of budget, so I'm sure there'll be more details. Councilmember Kovar, did you have something else you wanted to say? Nope, you're good. All right, we are adjourned until next week, all.